Talking with you tonight reminds me of a story which I heard during my days when I was Consul General of Israel in the southwestern states of the US, based in Houston, Texas, but I spent most of my time outside of Houston, driving along the highways and the freeways of Texas and the neighboring states of Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Bless you. And during those visits, I was exposed to the country culture and some very interesting country stories. And one of them has to do with new pastor, young pastor just out of School of Divinity, and he was hired by a small town church, and after a few weeks on the job, the senior pastor told him, young man, the pulpit is yours next Sunday, better get ready for that. And this young man dedicated the whole week to research and compile a very powerful, passionate sermon. Come Sunday morning, he walks to the church, opens the door. The place is absolutely empty, but for a soul worshiper, because everybody heard that the senior pastor has taken off. So they figured out, if the senior pastor take off, why shouldn't we? The young man didn't know what to do, was waiting for about 20-25 minutes, and then he came down the pulpit, walked all the way to the back of the church where the soul worshiper was sitting, and said, sir, I'm a new guy here in town. What do you think we should do? Should we proceed with the service? Should I proceed with the sermon? Or should we call it off and go back home? And the soul worshiper said, well, I don't know why you asked me this question. I never went to School of Divinity, but I know from my experience, if I drive my pickup truck in the prairie and loaded with full load of hay, and I see one cow in the prairie, don't I feed that cow? The young pastor was very impressed with that common sense. He jumps back to the pulpit and he proceeds with an hour and a half of a passionate sermon, and it was over. He's all perspiring, comes down the pulpit, goes back to this soul worshiper who's still there, seated at the end of the church, said, how was it? And the worshiper said, I don't know why you keep asking me this question. Did I go to School of Divinity? But I know that when I drive my pickup truck with a full load of hay to the prairie and I see one cow, do I feed that cow with a whole load? So I'm not going to so-called feed you with a whole load on Israel and US-Israel relations and the Middle East, but I would like to touch briefly upon some aspects which I believe are essential in order to understand the reality, first of all, of US-Israel relations. Conventional wisdom is that US extends a very generous hand to Israel, and Israel receives the US foreign aid with much gratitude, and that more or less the essence of the relations between those two countries. The reality used to be like that early on, following the 1948 establishment of a Jewish state, with 650,000 Jews surrounded by Arab countries who assaulted it with an aim to eradicate the Jewish state. But the reality has changed dramatically, at least since some 40 years ago, certainly in recent years. And the reality has been that we're not anymore engaged in a foreign aid type of relations between the two countries. In fact, and I will provide few well-documented examples, we are involved with very, very sophisticated and high net worth American investment in Israel, which yields back a net worth of a few 100% return a year, which is probably the highest rate of return on any investments ever made by the United States. And how do I arrive at such a statement? When I was Consul General for Israel in the Southwest, I visited the plant in Fort Worth, Texas, which manufactures the F-16 and recently the F-35, which is the most advanced combat plane anywhere in the world. The plant manager took me around, introduced me to a group which he referred to as the ACE team on site. That was a group of Israeli Air Force men who are there 24/7. And the reason they are there 24/7 is to transmit to the plant lessons learned by Israeli pilots as far as operations, the way the plane is navigated, as far as maintenance, and as far as repairs. And according to the plant manager back in the late 1980s, I assume since then it has been expanded, according to him, over 600 modifications were introduced into the F-16 resulting from those Israeli lessons. Gave me examples: the cockpit, 50% developed due to Israeli experience, Israeli lessons. The firing control, 75% outcome of Israeli lessons. When I asked him if he could attach a $sign to those 600 plus modifications, his response was ballpark, mega billion-dollar bonanza to the manufacturer. Along the same lines, I remember walking into the office of a congressman from Tennessee. I was in charge of Israel's congressional relations at the Israeli embassy, and I spent basically all my time on Capitol Hill. And one of my visits there was to the office of then Congressman Zach Wamp from Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was a senior member of the House Homeland Security Committee. And according to the congressman, Northrop Grumman plant in his district, Northrop Grumman is one of the probably 3-4 top defense industries in America. They have plants in probably 30 or more states in the Union. The plant in Chattanooga manufactures robots which neutralize explosives. And according to the congressman, a few years ago, Israel decided to buy that robot from his district. And to quote him, the impact was similar to a AAA store entering a new shopping mall. When a AAA store moves into a shopping mall, it's a signal for other stores and for the public to come to that mall, because if the AAA store chain thinks that this is a worthy initiative, well, why not partake in this worthy initiative? And according to him, the impact of the Israeli announcement was a substantial increase in exports to other countries who wanted to follow the Israeli decision. But he said that was the beginning of the Israeli benefits to Northrop Grumman and his district, because he said every single week There are the conference calls conducted between the plant management and the users in Israel, and the users share with the plant their lessons, which once again, just like the F-16, it has to do with the operation of the robot, the maintenance and the repairs. For Israel, it's obvious, because we want next time to get better product, and that is a major unique benefit obviously to the manufacturer. And according to the congressman, or according to the plant manager, which registered that with the congressman, those lessons have enhanced the competitiveness of the plant in the global competition, spared or saved the Northrop Grumman plant some 10 to 20 years of research and development, which would have been required to reach such innovations, modifications, upgrades of the robot. And the bottom line was not only that research and development advanced dramatically, and not only that export was expanded very substantially, but employment in the district of the congressman also was expanded very, very impressively due to that relationship with Israel. Israel is using a few hundred US defense industry items. We don't only fly the F-16, we also fly the F-15, which is manufactured by McDonnell Douglas in Missouri. I assume that the mega billion-dollar benefits to Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth, Texas, is also shared by McDonnell Douglas in Missouri, and so are hundreds of other defense items such as missiles and missile launchers, etc., all of which, obviously, we are extremely grateful for the US to provide us, but we are also returning to the US substantial benefit. It's not a handout to a needy person, which by itself is very remarkable, but in this case, it's not a needy person. In a way, Israel has been the battle-tested laboratory of the American defense industry, providing benefits which exceed 100%, hundreds of percentage on the initial investment. How do I arrive at assessment of hundreds of percent? The late General Alexander Haig, when he served as the Supreme Commander of NATO and later on the Secretary of State, was known by his very intense support and encouragement of expanded US-Israel collaboration. And when he was asked, General Haig, how come you're so enthusiastic about working with the Israelis? He had a standard response. I want to expand ties with Israel because Israel constitutes, said General Haig, the largest American aircraft carrier, which does not require a single American on board, which cannot be sunk, which is deployed in a most critical area for America's national security, homeland security, and economy. And if there would not be a Jewish state in the western part of the Middle East or the eastern flank of the Mediterranean, then the US would have to deploy a few more real aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, to the Indian Ocean, to deploy few more real military divisions to the Middle East in order to protect its own interest in the region. That would have cost the US, said General Haig, anywhere between $15 and $20 billion every single year. You may know that the US, what is called erroneously foreign aid to Israel, was $3.1 billion until this year. From this year onward, for the next 10 years, it's $3.8 billion. But as much as This is significant for Israel and absolutely received with much gratitude by Israel, but both sides should know it yields to the US a few 100% rate of return every single year when it comes to defense industry alone, when it comes to deployment of troops in the Middle East. To that, one could add the fact that one is exposed to and one talks to members of the Intelligence Committee in the Senate or in the House, that the US receives from Israel annually military counter-terrorism intelligence from Israel in a quality which exceeds by far that which the US receives intelligence-wise from all NATO countries combined. And one could go on and on discussing the benefits to America. Maybe one last example is a visit of mine a few years ago, some 3 years ago. There was a major Christian gathering in Dallas, Texas, and I spoke there about what has Israel done recently for the US. And at the end of my presentation, people came over with their own feedback. One of them was a retired combat Air Force man, American Air Force man, and he said, I would like to add one more element to your inventory of Israeli benefits to America. And that, he said, is taken from my own, he said, personal experience as an American combat Air Force man. And according to that American combat pilot, the most productive time for American combat pilots during their service is joint exercises with the Israeli combat pilots. My response was that while I very much love to hear such assessment, I have difficulties accepting it because, with all due respect, aren't we using American hardware, the F-15, F-16, now also the F-35? And besides, obviously, the IQ of the Israeli pilots is not above the IQ of American combat pilots. So why would American combat pilots benefit most when they conduct joint exercises, maneuvers with the Israeli pilots? His response was, well, you talk like a person who knows nothing about Air Force. And he said, we Air Force people know that there's a difference between pilots, ordinary pilots like us in the US, and the Israelis. The Israelis always fly under do or die state of mind. Whether you call it training, whether you call it operation, you're always, as a pilot, within enemy's radar and enemy's missile because of the very narrow waistline of Israel, which is like a nice-sized congressional district in the United States. When you fly under do or die state of mind, told me the American pilot, you extend the capabilities of the American plane to a much larger scope than we do in America when we don't fly under do or die state of mind. When you fly under do or die state of mind, you also maneuver very creatively and very audaciously. All that we Americans witness only when we practice with you, and therefore when the maneuver is over, all of us feel that we have expanded our capabilities as combat pilot. And again, there is multitude of such examples, but I would like to wrap up my, at least, opening remarks, also referring in a telegraphic way to the foundations of US-Israel relations. I spoke about national security, homeland security. Some people talk about the Israeli lobby in America, which is doing a remarkable job believing Christians, the Jewish community, etc. The reality is that the foundations of U.S.-Israel relations extend dramatically beyond intelligence and counterterrorism and defense, and I didn't talk yet about commercial benefits to America through roughly 250 American research and development centers in Israel benefiting from the brain power in Israel. But one has to go back to 1620, in my mind, the arrival of the Mayflower and then the Arabella and other major boats coming to the U.S., establishing what today is the United States. Those were the early pilgrims. And the early pilgrims, as far as they were concerned, they left modern-day Egypt, Britain. They went through the modern-day parting of the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the sail of 6-8 weeks. And the destination was modern-day Promised Land or modern-day Canaan. Here we are in Jerusalem. We in Israel have only one Jerusalem. It's the historical, it's the fundamental Jerusalem. But in the US, there are 18 Jerusalems. And in addition to 18 Jerusalems, there are also 32 Salems. You may know that Salem or Shalem in Hebrew, that's the original name of Jerusalem in the Bible. And it's interesting that there are 18 Jerusalems in the United States, 18 in Jewish tradition. In Hebrew stands for life. The way you spell life in Hebrew equals 18 in Hebrew. We have numerical value to every letter. And when you add 18 Jerusalems and 32 Salems, guess what? You get 50. And there are 50 states in the Union, but more than that, when you go back to the early pilgrims, when you go back to the founding fathers, you find out that at the foundation of the whole idea of what liberty is all about, among other things, but very prominently so, was the concept of the Jubilee. And the Jubilee in the Bible, in the Old Testament, stands for the role model of what liberty is all about. That was employed by the founding fathers. And in fact, next time you see the real Liberty Bell in Philadelphia or any of the hundreds of replicas throughout the US, pay attention to the inscription on the Liberty Bell. It's a quote from that portion of the Bible which refers to Jubilee: proclaim liberty upon the earth and unto all the inhabitants thereof. Those are what we call the Judeo-Christian foundations, which in my mind have set the US on a very, very definite course of affinity with the concept of a Jewish state and friendship with the realization of that concept since 1948. I frequent the US 3 to 5 times a year, always spend a week on Capitol Hill briefing legislators and their staffers. And when one walks into the chamber of the House, one see that around the chamber, inside the chamber, there are busts of 23 key lawgivers in human history. In the middle, facing the speaker, is the bust of the face of Moses. Now, not only is he in the middle facing the speaker, but the other 22 are in profile. Moses is the only one who looks straight. When I first saw that, I asked the curator of the Capitol building, why is this bust different than all other busts? Why they're all in profile, only he looks straight? And his response was interesting. He asked me, aren't you a Jew from Israel? You should know. Moses is the source. The rest are the derivatives of Moses. Therefore, the source looks at the speaker and the derivatives stare at the source. Therefore, they are in profile. And last and not least, you cross Small Street which separates between the Capitol building and the U.S. Supreme Court, and you walk upstairs, you come to the main hall of the U.S. Supreme Court, and there are the seats of the 9 Supreme Court justices. Above them at the ceiling, once again, Moses holding the tablets, staring at the Supreme Court justices. And I remember first time I saw that, turning to the policeman at the door to the main hall. And I emphasize policeman. It was not the chaplain of the Supreme Court. It was not a tour guide, but a policeman with a blue uniform of the police department in Washington, D.C. And I say to him, I'm a tourist from Israel, and I wonder what is my Moses doing there at the ceiling? And the policeman responded right away, sir, that's how we pay respect to the foundation of our culture. And this is not the only Moses in the Supreme Court. There are 7 more statues and engravements throughout the Supreme Court with Moses, with the tablets, which again highlight the foundation of the very, very unique ties between the U.S. and Israel here in the Middle East, in addition, again, to the geostrategic mutual benefits to both countries. I would like to end here and turn it now to your opinion, your statements, questions, and it can be provocative, it can be anywhere. In fact, the more provocative, the more productive it could be. So go ahead. Yes, please.
Is there a organization that aligns U.S. commerce and Israel commerce? Is there a organization that is responsible? I'm sure there is. I just want to know what the name of it.
The U.S.-Israel Chamber of Commerce here in Israel. There are different regional U.S.-Israel chambers of commerce in the U.S. And again, it works both ways. It's a mutual benefit. There are many, an increasing number of Israeli companies, especially in the high-tech area, increasingly in irrigation and agriculture technologies that start operation in the U.S., that have branches in the United States. And as I mentioned before, there are about 250 and growing American research and development centers in Israel, all of them, by the way, owned by the giants of the American high-tech sector. For instance, Intel has 3 manufacturing plants in Israel, in addition to 2 research and development centers in Israel. Cisco has some 60 small Israeli high-tech companies which they invested in, expecting to benefits from whatever they develop, which is consistent with what Cisco itself develops, manufactures, exports, etc. And there are many groundbreaking technologies which have been developed, were developed in Israel. A few months ago, once again, Intel acquired an Israeli company which has developed game-changing technology in the area of automotive or autonomous cars. And from what I understand, there is expectation that in a few years we'll have autonomous cars replacing the current cars today. Much of that research is conducted in Israel. There is a town in the south, a city in southern Israel called Beersheba, which until a few years ago was kind of a second-rate city in Israel. In the last few years, Beersheba surged to #2 cyber technology center anywhere in the world. The US is by far the #1. Beersheba now in southern Israel is #2, with McDonnell Douglas and other American giants, EMC, which is the leading computer storage company, German companies, all investing in cyber technology in Israel in general, but particularly in Beersheba. And the aim, again, is to leverage the brain power here in the country. Now, it's not only brain power, but I would say it's the particular experience in Israel. Israel, historically, before the modern day Israel, going back to biblical Jewish state, we have always been challenged, and that's an understatement, by our environment. Challenged militarily, challenged terroristically by our environment, which still does not digest what they call infidel state in what they call the abode of Islam. But in addition, there are also natural challenges, climatic challenges. For instance, natural rainfall has come down dramatically in the last 70 years of Israel's modern day existence. Back in 48, we had 650,000 Jews, 150,000 Arabs. We have today dramatically less natural waterfall. We have today 9 million people in Israel, or almost 9 million people in Israel, but water reserve at an all-time high. Now, supposedly that defies logic. If we have all-time low natural waterfall and population has expanded more than 10 times, we should have major problem with water reserve. How come we have all-time high water reserve? Due to irrigation high technology, which we had to develop because of the constraint. Constraints are not very sympathetic upon identifying them, but they encourage you, in fact, they force you to excel and to develop beyond expectations many times. When it comes to making up for the very, very low waterfall in Israel, Israel has become by far the global leader in the recycling of sewage. Today in Israel, we recycle 75% to 80% of our sewage for agricultural purposes, but the quality also fits human consumption. Now, I'm not saying that only because I read it somewhere or I believe or I don't believe, but until recently I was a member of the board of one of the top irrigation companies in Israel, and we spent time on site of such sewage recycling plants. Every such site has European inspectors. The reason the European inspectors are there because Israel has become one of the major supplier of produce to Europe, and they want to make sure that we use the proper quality water. And they certify that not only is it proper for agriculture, it's also proper for human consumption. Now, that's in addition to the desalination technologies which we have developed long time ago. But that's again one of the very typical qualities of Israel derived from the very, very challenging environment which has enveloped us.
Are those desalination facilities modular, or are they plants that are built out on the Mediterranean? In other words, can they float into different places?
It's permanent plants. Yeah. Yes, please.
Earlier you mentioned that you have to exist in a do or die state of mind to extend the scope of your capability. You're talking about the Israeli
Air Force.
Air Force. So do you feel like as an Israeli you embody this in your life, and how? And then the second question is, how would you suggest we as young men embody that in our own lives and take that back to the U.S.?
Well, in many respects, you're very lucky in the US. I remember when I traveled around the Southwest as Israel's Consul General there, I met many Texans who are very proud of their state, and we're talking about the similarities between Texas and Israel. And the point I made those years, and I still do when I meet folks from Texas, is that yes, there are many similarities between Texas, which has the nickname the Lone Star State, and Israel, which in many respects is a state of the Lone Star of David. And I said, however, there is a major difference because every single state neighboring Texas in a way envies Texas, and some of the people translate that into hatred for Texans, I think for all the wrong reasons, but there are facts of life. And I mentioned to the Texans, your neighbors, they don't like you, they envy you, some of them even hate you. Our neighbors want us out of the Middle East. Our neighbors are killing us. Our neighbors terrorize us. Our neighbors don't only hate us or envy us, they go way beyond that. Now, what has made Israel successful in facing such a critical survival challenge and leveraging it to excel in many areas? I believe, first and foremost, education. Education has to do with schools. Education has to do with the house of worships. For instance, in synagogues in Israel, as it is in Judaism as a whole, every single week you re-study a portion of the 5 books of Moses. And you do it every single year. During Passover, you re-study, you re-read, you re-tell the story of the Exodus again and again and again. And the reason it's done again and again is not that it creates redundancy. The idea is to implant it in the psyche of Jews in Israel and outside of Israel. Why? Because roots are extremely essential for our future, just like with trees. So education is like your roots and the trunk of any tree, and there has been systematic attempt for thousands of years now, and for the last 70 years of modern day Israel, to continuously fertilize and water those roots, let alone that we are aware that the old days sages were, in most cases, way ahead of contemporary sages. And we should study their own lessons of those days. The bottom line is, when you look at some of the characterization of, not all, but the vast majority of Israelis, most Israelis, and I would add left or right, hawks or doves, conservative or liberal, are very patriotic. And most of us are very patriotic because, again, of this emphasis on education at home, in school, in the community, in the house of worships, etc. Most of us Israelis are not only patriotic, but we are also very much attached to our roots. Most Israelis are very much community oriented. When you combine those elements, attachment to roots and patriotism and community responsibility, you get a very successful formula to face almost any challenge and to overcome those challenges and to, again, to leverage those challenges into future enhancement of what I call the positive quality. This is not patriotism or attachment to roots or responsibility, which calls for the demise of our neighbors or demise of our enemies. It's overcoming their assault, assault on us. And last and not least, there are certain elements going back, I mentioned before, the old sages. There are some lessons which we learn as secular or observant. Myself, if I were to characterize myself, I'm not an observant Jew. I have highest respect for my tradition, for my religion, for my holidays, for the Sabbath, but I'm not part of the element in Israel, outside of Israel, which observes Judaism, does not travel on the Sabbath, observes many of the legal elements of the Old Testament, etc. But as a secular Jew, I'm very much aware of some of the teachings of our forefathers. One of them, for instance, which I think is very related to the performance of Israel today, they ask you a rhetorical question and provide right away an answer. Who is the smart person? And it's a rhetorical question, and the immediate response is he or she who learn from everyone. Namely, you should not say, oh, I'm going only to listen to the so-called smart people. Who cares about the less intelligent, supposedly less intelligent? Our sages have taught us everyone is a source of lesson for you, so pay attention to whatever you hear from anyone in your environment. And I think that has been the secret of the Jewish people historically and the contemporary Jewish. I know that when I was in the military in Israel, we have compulsory service, which you asked before what my suggestions. I think that any Western democracy would benefit tremendously from compulsory service. And I know when I was in compulsory service, and then in Israel we served as reservists for 20, 30 years, depends on the unit that you serve. And I remember as a reservist officer, I used to come for 20 days, 30 days a year with my artillery company. And on every single occasion, there were privates and corporals. I was a first lieutenant who came to me, with all due respect, Yoram, let me teach you how to do it in a better way. And I was never upset with that. I said, thank God there are such people around me. But this has been an atmosphere which I believe has fed the enhancement of the military performance, but it also acts the same way in high tech, in agriculture, in irrigation, which has facilitated Israel's rise to higher and higher qualities.
When you were the ambassador, tell us about your time in Washington.
I was at the Israeli embassy in Washington. I was not the ambassador. We have at the Israeli embassy in Washington, we have the chief ambassador, and then we have a congressional unit. I was in charge of our congressional unit, and the head of the congressional unit also has a rank of an ambassador, in fact, senior ambassador, because of the very, I would say, sublime importance we attach to the U.S. Congress. If you follow U.S.-Israel relations since the establishment of Israel in 1948, every single American president until Trump, President Trump just started, and so far It has been very positive experience for U.S.-Israel relations. But from Harry Truman in 48 until the conclusion of President Obama's term, every single American president put pressure on Israel, some very brutally, others elegantly. Congress has always been, both chambers, House and Senate, have always been very friendly towards Israel. In fact, I know from my own experience, there has been much more than 1, 2, or single-digit initiatives by Congress which were opposed by American presidents when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations, and Congress prevailed because, as you, I assume, know, Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and whenever Congress wants, which doesn't happen very often, but whenever Congress wants, it can flex a very powerful muscle, constraining presidents, rolling back presidents. And when it comes to Israel, usually in the vast majority of cases, there has been vast majority of the American public supporting the initiatives, and Congress has to tune in to the voters. As they tell you, when you walk in the corridors of Congress, there is a battle cry out there in the districts, "We shall remember in November." And legislators are very sensitive to the power and sometimes the threat of the legislators. For me, of the constituents, for me it was, it still is, because I did it as an official Israeli, but since '93 I've been a private citizen when I established my own initiative, and I continue frequenting Congress, which has been very exciting to see the work on Capitol Hill. I'll be very candid with you. In Israel, it is a democracy, but myself, I never helped electing a single member of our legislature. Why? Because under the Israeli system, we elect a party. We don't have elections directly for particular legislators, and then the bosses of the party decide what to do with our vote. I'm envious of the American system because every one of you is responsible by voting or by staying home, it doesn't matter, for voting particular members of the House or particular senator. I have been very much impressed with the level of the staffers on Capitol Hill. I know until today, myself, I spend much more time with staffers than I do with legislators. And it's not because I don't consider legislators to be worthy, but the legislators tell you, Yoram, I cannot deal with all the issues on my agenda. That's the reason I have staff. And the staff in the Senate is huge. In the House, it's significant. In Israel, because of budget or because of other reasons, a member of Knesset has 2 staffers. 3 is amazingly major staff. If you are a significant senator, between your personal office and the different committees where you serve, you may have up to 60 or 70 staffers. And the responsible legislators will tell you, we have 4 or 5 issues which are our so-called babies. When it comes to the rest of the issues, talk with the particular staffer, and some of them are very experienced. I know a number of years ago, there was a staffer in the Senate, by now he retired. He was a retired general. And there was certain aura when you discussed with him different issues to do U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East at large, U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China. He was an experienced person. There are many specialists in different high-tech areas. There are many retirees from the intelligence U.S. community that serve on Capitol Hill. And I say that because I'm aware of the low popularity of Congress when it comes to American public. When you look at the polls, sometimes it's even down to single digit. It's absolutely unwarranted. From my experience, the vast majority of House members and senators work extremely hard, contrary to the perception, they go and have fun, they go to some parties. This is not the case on Capitol Hill. And in fact, I can tell you what happens, and you probably know some from your own experience, what happens when a legislator forgets his constituents. I remember one of the top Republicans who rose all the way to majority leader in the House, Congressman Eric Cantor from Virginia. He rose to the position of majority majority leader. And there was no doubt that he was on his way to become the speaker once John Boehner, those days, would retire. And Eric Cantor became overly consumed with his role as majority leader. And the one thing which underlines realistic legislators is them knowing that their 100% attention should be accorded to their district or else. And I think it was 2014, if I'm not mistaken, Eric Cantor was very busy recruiting new guys for midterm election. He was very busy raising money for all the Republican races. And everybody, all the pollsters and Eric Cantor himself, were certain he is a shoo-in in the Republican primary. And he came home on the eve of the primary, coming back from one of his busy events for Republicans in other districts, and he woke up listening to the news that amazing surprise. Eric Cantor was defeated in the Republican primary, and that was not the only case of a legislator who forgets to whom should be his utmost attention. But that goes back to Israel because, again, not in all cases, but in most districts and in most states, the notion of Israel rings a very positive, or has a very positive ring there for most constituents. And as a result, most House members and most senators are very, very positive towards enhancement of U.S.-Israel relations.
One more question. I think you had it, Greg, or you have a question? I have not.
Yeah, there is over there. Yeah.
Keith.
Yeah, I was just curious, how much, as far as the United States and Israel, how much joint training actually occurs between the militaries?
Well, again, I can share with you some personal experience there. I paid a visit to the office of former Republican Democratic Senate leader Harry Reid from Nevada. And his staffer was that retired general, Bob Herbert, who was his staffer, was a retired general. And I remember walking into the office, and we had a very interesting exchange, the retired general and myself. And suddenly the receptionist called, and she said, we have a colonel visiting the office, and he heard that we have somebody from Israel. He would like to stick his head and only say 2 words. So we said, by all means. In walked a colonel, in fact, a special operations colonel. And he said, I just want to say 2 words, thank you. So I asked him, what do you thank me for? He said, well, I just completed a tour of duty with my battalion in Iraq. We spent there a whole year. Before coming to Iraq, we went through Israel. And for 3 weeks, your top specialists trained us in southern Israel on facing suicide bombers, car bombs, and the very deadly IEDs, the improvised explosive devices. And he said that much of the credit to the fact that my battalion came back without a single fatality has to do with those 3 weeks in Israel. And then, he said, once we came to Iraq, we benefited from an Israeli-developed unmanned aerial vehicle, which enabled us to overwhelm the enemies in their own trenches rather than wait for the enemy in our trenches. I came to Birmingham, Alabama. I spent there 2.5, 3 days as a guest of one of the churches over there. And I asked them to set me up with as many people as they can during my stay in Birmingham. The first meeting was with then President of Birmingham College. It was retired General Chuck Krulek, who was Commandant of the US Marine Corps. And I remember the exchange. We spoke about Iraq and we spoke about Afghanistan and the whole Middle East. And as we were walking towards the door, I asked him, General, did you have any direct interaction with the Israeli military while in service? And he said, well, I was a specialist in the formulation of battle tactics, which we do in the US, mostly in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And if you were to come to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, you will be privy to discussions which in many cases are based on Israeli battles and their lessons which we learn from and apply it to our own battles. And he indicated that he fought in the first Gulf War back in 1991, liberating Kuwait. And he said before the war started, he, General Chuck Krulek, studied the way Israel faced Soviet tanks fighting Egypt in the desert of Sinai Peninsula back in 1973. And that was the basis for his tactics facing Soviet tanks in the service of Saddam Hussein in the deserts of Iraq. Few meetings later, there was a reception, and one of the persons in that reception was an active duty Marine Corps major. And once again, I asked him if he had any direct experience with the Israeli Defense Forces. And his response was, if you would have time to join me to my base here in Alabama, you would see that in my base we specialize in urban warfare. The way we train for urban warfare is through a model which you Israelis built for us based on your urban warfare experience in Lebanon, in Judea and Samaria, and in Gaza. And once a year, he said, he, along with other specialists in urban warfare from the US, traveled to Israel to get the most recent update by Israelis who, unfortunately, are involved in an ongoing urban warfare, urban rural warfare, as we have to if we want to overcome our challenges. But once again, we share that experience with the US, which obviously spares the US many losses, provides the US a major edge over its enemies and over many rogue regimes in the world.
You're, in closing, where are we headed? Where is Israel headed with what's happening right
I've been an ultimate optimist, but reality-based optimist. Namely, I'm not an optimist as far as embracing the idea that tomorrow or in the medium range we are going to see overall peace here in the Middle East. I'm a realistic optimist, and my optimism is a derivative of the quality of the Israeli people, which I believe has exhibited determination and capabilities to withstand pressure of both terrorism and conventional warfare, as well as I mentioned before, pressure which sometimes is even brutal pressure on Israel. And therefore, I'm very, very optimistic. But that does not mean that I overlook what in my mind is a fact, that we are going to have few more wars in the coming months or in the coming years. I look at the Middle East around me, and I don't know if you're aware, but Islam has been around for 14 centuries, beginning with the 7th century. Since the 7th century until today, the Islamic societies around us in the Middle East have yet to experience intra-Muslim or intra-Arab peaceful coexistence. And I think the logical conclusion is, if they have not been able yet to experience internal intra-Muslim, intra-Arab peaceful coexistence, are we realistic in assuming that they are going to accord us peaceful coexistence, which they are yet to accord towards one another? Now, this for me is not a discouraging reality. It's a reality which presents a challenge, which I firmly believe, based on the performance until today, based on ancient performance and modern day performance, we definitely are able to face, are able to overcome, and that has been a source of my optimism. Last and not least, from day one in 1948 until today, we have been involved in ongoing war, ongoing physical war, ongoing war of attrition, ongoing terrorism. We haven't had yet, in the last 70 years of our modern day existence, a single day of peace with our environment. But guess what? If you would have told the founding fathers of 1948, especially the founding father, Mr. Ben-Gurion, who was the ultimate optimist, if you would have told him back in 1948 that by 2018, Israel, jointly with the US, is going to be the global leader in the development and manufacturing and exporting of unmanned aerial vehicles, even that ultimate optimist would have asked you, what have you been drinking? What have you been smoking? And here we are. So there's no reason for Israelis or friends of Israel to be anything but ultimate optimists, but provided that we maintain that sense of patriotism, sense of attachment to roots, sense of communal responsibility, and sense of anything but appeasement, anything but delusions as far as our future. We have to be in touch with reality and not escape into wishful thinking, which is a deadly trap for democratic societies. Thank you very much.
I'm going to thank